Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Can everyone hear me clearly? I'm conscious that I'm introducing someone who is a trained lecturer and that I lack those skills, so I'm just going to do my best here. Welcome to what's going to be the inaugural address of our new President and Vice-Chancellor, Professor Duncan Ivison. Firstly, a bit of housekeeping. We're not expecting a fire alarm, so if anything goes off, it's either somebody's phone, so if you wouldn't mind putting those on silent, I'd be grateful, or it is a fire alarm and we should take it seriously and do as we are asked. So I'm Philippa Hurd. I'm chair of the board of the University of Manchester and Pro-Chancellor. And one of my first tasks when I first arrived about 2 years ago was to oversee the process of the recruitment of a new president and vice-chancellor. And I think very sensibly what I did is involve a lot of other people. It was an important time for us. We were heading into our bicentenary, and we needed, at the end, as we came to the end of one strategy process, we needed to lay the foundations for the next 100 years with a new strategy. The many, many people that we enlisted to help with this process, many of you, or some of you were here early, there were hundreds of them, and I am hugely grateful to all of the staff, students and supporters who worked on the specification, assessment and the candidate welcome. It was a global search with some really strong and a diverse range of candidates, but it was truly a community appointment. I'm therefore delighted this afternoon to introduce Duncan to you. It's his inaugural address, it's Foundation Day. Duncan was born in Canada, and after studying and working in the UK and the US, he comes to us from senior leadership roles in the University of Sydney. In Australia, though, he also worked with the then new Labour government with quite a lot of similar challenges to our own on the Australian Universities Accord, which set out a roadmap for higher education in Australia out to 2050. And this kind of long-term thinking on the role that universities play in supporting prosperity and growth and social justice is really important for us to define in the UK today. So what Duncan's going to do in the next short period of time is share his views on the future of the sector and what it might mean for the university and for Manchester. So I'm going to invite him to the stage.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Philippa, and thank you all very much for coming this afternoon. Look, it's a real honor and privilege, slightly daunting to have an inaugural address looming over your head, so I'll have to change the slides quickly. But it's an honor and privilege to be joining you this afternoon, but more generally to be joining the University of Manchester. What an extraordinary place. And it's been an amazing experience starting in this role and getting to know so many of you. So what I wanted to do is just share some ideas. I'm not going to share any answers. So I'm a philosopher by training, so what we are generally good at is posing questions. And there'll be a quiz at the end, and your drinks will follow on from that. So I'm going to pose more questions than answers, but I hope it kind of gets some thoughts spinning in your head, and then there'll be hopefully a time for questions and answers afterwards. But it is indeed a very auspicious time, right? It's 20 years since the merger that sort of created the institution we inhabit now, 200 years since the university sort of emerged out of the Owens Mechanical Institute and grew to the extraordinary institution that it is today. And you know, Friedrich Schlegel, a famous German philosopher of history, once said that a historian is a historian is a prophet facing backwards. And I think what he meant is that our history not only tells us, in a sense, where we've come from and who we are today, but it tells us and should shape how we think about the future. So that's really my goal this afternoon, is to try and plant some seeds about our future. We're all going to start as prophets facing backwards and see if we can turn around and face the future. So as I said, for me, it's getting the question that matters. And no doubt this will be exasperating for those of you who sit in meetings with me for a few years to come. But I guess the two questions that I'd really like us to focus on this afternoon are these. And it's the second version of this which is probably more important. So one fundamental question we're going to ask in the strategy process is, what kind of university do we want to be by 2035? I think the more interesting question, and I think the harder question, is what kind of university do we need to be by 2035? I'm sure there are many of you who have answers to the first question that you would probably want to shout out now at the new Vice-Chancellor. But what I want us to do is just sit with this question for the next 10 or 15 minutes. And I'm going to try and mount a case for at least how we should think about this, and then we can have a conversation about it. What kind of university do we need to be by 2035 is, I think, the most important question for us to ask. And I think over the next decade, we're going to need to be more impactful. This is my proposition, this is my hypothesis, and I'm going to try to build a case for it. I think over the next decade, we're going to need to be more impactful, more engaged, more innovative, and more committed to excellence in teaching and research than we've ever been at any period in our history. That's my hypothesis, that's my proposition to you. And I think there are two general reasons for it. And then I'm going to try and explain a bit more about why I think that is. I think the two most important reasons are, first of all, because I think, given the nature of the problems the world faces, that our city faces, that the region faces, that the country faces, given the nature of the problems we face, we have an obligation to harness our teaching and research for the public good in new ways. Moreover, I think this is what great 21st century universities will be defined by, and I'll come back to that a bit later. So I think we have a kind of moral obligation. Let me put it even stronger. Right? Philosophers like to sort of egg it on, right? I think we have a moral obligation to harness our teaching and research for the public good, just given the kinds of thing our world faces, whether it's climate change, whether it's the disruptive sort of force of technology, whether it's the kind of deeply multidimensional entrenched disadvantages that we increasingly see, indeed in our city, but globally as well. We need to harness our teaching and research in new ways, in innovative ways. But also, I think there's a kind of what you might call instrumental reason, right? Higher education is changing. And if we're going to flourish in the next 100 years, I think we need to change as well. And not just to survive, right? We don't just want to kind of hang on. We don't just want to kind of limp along. We want to be one of the great public universities of the 21st century with a distinctive identity and a distinctive mission. So I think that's why, those two reasons, I think are why we're going to need to be more impactful, more engaged, and more innovative than at any point in our history. So let me unpack that a bit more. This isn't a plug for a friend's book, but it's just a way of visualizing, right, the coming wave. What is coming at us? In fact, we're already, sorry for the Australian metaphor, we're already in the surf, right? The water is crashing around us as we speak. What are the defining features of the changes that are occurring in our world that I think universities are going to have to get to grips with? And I think there's a number of them. I mean, take your pick. There will be, I know there are experts in the room. I'm looking now, there are experts in the room who do this as their work. So people will have all kinds of ideas. But here's my sort of few, I guess, ideas. The first, obviously, is the AI revolution, which we're living amongst. But it feels to me as if we're just at the very beginning of it, the very tip of it. How is it going to transform higher education? How is it going to transform the way we think about our teaching and research? Just, in the FT this morning, there was an amazing piece where they described how Google's DeepMind is developing a new science-based large language model that will serve as a kind of AI assistant in the laboratories of the near future that will not only help us design experiments, but provide new predictive powers to test hypotheses and predict outcomes. I mean, this is rolling out literally as we speak. And that's only one aspect of what's happening. So the AI revolution is a profound one. As much as we might be tired of hearing it, I think it's a profound one for us as an institution, as much as it is for us as a country and as a global community. I think the other thing that's happening is what I call hyperconnectivity. And by this, I don't even mean the way in which we can connect through social media and the way in which we are connected to the kind of streams of knowledge and streams of conversation across time zones, across multiple domains, but just the way that things are connecting as never before. What does that mean for higher education? What does that mean for our world? There are both positive aspects and negative aspects, as we've seen. Something happens in one part of the world, and within hours, it's playing out on the streets of our city, of our neighborhood, of our suburb. So that hyperconnectivity is also, as we all know, transforming higher education. How do we respond to that? How do we make sense of that? And then, of course, there's the challenge of innovation to zero. The planet is essentially on fire. We're not actually moving fast enough to address the environmental crises we face. And the only way we're going to get there, really, honestly, aside from some difficult political decisions and some hard choices to make about the way we live, is through innovation. We're going to have to innovate to a zero carbon emitting world. How are we going to do that? What role do universities play? Again, going back to where I started, I think we have, as a research-intensive university, a moral obligation to be thinking hard about this and thinking about who we need to work with to deliver it. And then finally, what I'll call the politics of volatility, right? And I think this was beautifully captured by a colleague of ours, Rob Ford, when he described, the Labour government's historic majority, right? I think it's one of the largest majorities in recent political history in the UK, as being yet one of the most precarious and fragile in recent political history. That's the kind of world we live in, when you can have a hundreds of seat majority and yet be on the verge of political crisis almost instantly. And this volatility, I think, is shot through our contemporary political world. And this indeed is also impacting higher education. How do we respond to that? How do we make sense of that? Okay, so those are the big kind of mega trends that we need to reflect on. And if these are the kind of mega trends that we need to sort of think about in terms of the next 100 years for the university, at least also for the next 10 years, but also for the next 100 years, then let's now turn to the UK. And if we're thinking about the future of the University of Manchester, what's changing in the UK that's important for us to make sense of? Of course, these big mega trends are shaping the country, but I thought it would be useful to test some of these ideas with you and see what you think. I mean, one fascinating thing is, of course, this demographic sort of splurge that we're in the midst of, right? The number of 18 to 30-year-olds or 16 to 18-year-olds is growing quite significantly, 18% roughly over the next 10 years. And that's a 30% increase in the number of young people who by 2030 are going to be going to university. How do we respond to that? There are literally going to be hundreds of thousands of students thinking about higher education for the first time that we haven't heard from before, coming from communities and neighborhoods that haven't engaged with us before. how do we think about that? What's our role in addressing that demographic burst? Of course, from 2030, it then starts to decline. So how do we prepare for that? Or are we thinking about the relationship between that community and new communities who aren't between the ages of 18 and 24, or 16 and 18, and their opportunities for higher education? I think we should. But even if, put aside the sort of demographic issue, let's just look at what economists and trade unions and industry associations, and indeed the government's own departments are telling us about the future. We're going to need 11 million new graduates. That's on top of the ones we have now by 2035. We know that almost 90% of all new jobs are going to require some kind of graduate training, some kind of higher education training. We're going to need 1 million more health professionals over the next 10 years, 1 million new teachers, and as much as the new government claims they're going to hire them all, I think we've got a lot of work to do to get there. What's our response to that agenda as the largest university, one of the largest universities in the country, with one of the largest health faculties in the country's second and, of course, most dynamic and coolest city of all? What's our response to that? Moreover, all of us in this room, 90% of us, will need to learn new skills and adapt in new ways given the way the world is changing. Again, what is our role in that as the University of Manchester? Are we positioned to deliver that given the way we're configured now? How should this feature in our thinking about the future of the university? Then let's zero down to Manchester, right? What's happening in Manchester that we need to be reflecting on over the next few months as we start to think through our strategy? You know, the case for change in Manchester is really extraordinary, and of course the relationship between the university and the city is unique, not just in the UK, but globally. In many ways, it's the reason why I'm here. I don't think there's any other university in the world that is so embedded, so sort of ingrained in the life of the city, and for which both the city leadership and the university have such high expectations of others. You don't know how special that is. I'm telling you, it is really special. So this is also something we need to think about. But how is that going to change? How is that going to evolve? How do we build on that extraordinary legacy? We're now one of the fastest growing economies in the UK, almost twice the economic growth in the last quarter from that nationally. So something is happening here. It's increasingly an economy and a community driven by innovation and growth. We launched Sister last week on the previous site of one of our sister universities that now forms the part of the University of Manchester. You know, innovation and growth is clearly the future that Manchester is embracing. But what's our role in that? We've got to this point. What's the next phase? The political culture of Manchester is also, I think, unique and dynamic. And this is not a party political broadcast. One thing I feel in Manchester, and it's true, is you hear people saying from, you know, Bev Craig and Annie Burnham on through, place first, party second. And, you know, often when a politician says something like that, you pause and say, yeah, right. But I think it happens to be true. It's something that seems to me deeply felt, and it goes back to great civic leaders in times past. And of course, you know, we're seeing more young people go into higher education of any kind, of various kinds, than ever before. And we're starting to see that permeate through the city and our suburbs in new and exciting ways. But what more can we do? What's our role as an anchor institution to support that? All this is incredibly exciting. And yet, to go back to where I started about the moral obligation institutions like ours have, 1 in 4 of our children live in poverty. And that number has been growing, not getting smaller. We also know that we have huge challenges around economic inactivity and long-term illness, amongst people who should be living in the prime of their lives. That number is getting worse, not better. So amongst all the extraordinary excitement, of sister, of innovation, of the extraordinary things that are happening in Manchester, the cranes and the skyscrapers and the sort of gleaming infrastructure, many of our citizens are living worse lives, not better lives. What's our role as the University of Manchester to contribute to tackling those challenges? Okay. And here now we need to ask ourselves, how are we performing? How should we think about our own performance and thinking about our own challenges as we look into the future? So we've gone from the world to the country to the city and now to our campus. And also thinking about the sector. The trend, as I say, is not quite our friend, both in terms of the higher education sector, but also in some parts of the university. There are challenges that we have. I'm sure all of you can think of some. I'm going to put a couple on the table for you to sort of ruminate around. I mean, for the sector, one of the biggest things is, as a relative newcomer coming back to the UK is now the only country in the OECD in which students are paying the vast proportion of the costs of their education. We are at the bottom of the list in the OECD in terms of the public contribution to the costs of a student's education. They are bearing something like 74% of the load. That's the highest. Put it another way, that's the highest in the OECD. That's not going to change anytime soon, even if we have a new government that's sympathetic and wants to see higher education improve. So that's going to be a challenge that we have to get to grips with. Our global rankings are in what I would call a sort of elegant decline right now, and there are many reasons for that. And there are many things wrong with global rankings, of course, but this is at least what other people perceive, for example, of our research right now. Are there things we need to address? Are there challenges that we're not being honest about? Are there things that we need to tackle? Our competitors are doing a bit better. Of course, our student experience needs to improve. Our NSS scores, as many of you in the room will know and are working very hard to address, have not gotten better over a number of years. The numbers, in fact, are getting a bit worse. What's the challenge there? How do we need to reimagine how we think about the teaching and learning culture of the institution? What new things do we need to do? What things do we need to stop doing in order to improve our teaching? That's a rather confronting number, 146th in the sector for our NSS scores. That's something that we need to tackle together. Having said that, there are also really exciting things happening. And I mentioned before the role of innovation and the dynamism in the Manchester economy. And I have no doubt this is a kind of hard slide to interpret, on a Wednesday afternoon. I had to pause and say, what day is it today? On a Wednesday afternoon, late in the afternoon. But we're seeing extraordinary success in getting our ideas and getting our knowledge out into the world in new ways, through commercialization, through partnership with industry, through people investing in our ideas. And we need to build on that. But it's also something that has to get better, given the reasons, given some of the data I provided to you earlier. This is going to be a big part of Manchester's future and a big part of our country's future. What's our response to it? We're doing extraordinary things in relation to social responsibility and sustainability. But where do we go from here? No room for complacency. What does it mean to think about social responsibility at this point in time in the 21st century? 10 years from now, what does it mean to be a socially responsible university? Sometimes people think of that as a kind of nice thing, as a kind of, it's a kind of cool thing, and it is, but it's also a hard question. What does it mean to be a socially responsible university in the world that's changing in the way that I've tried to show? Now, some of you will recognize where I've adapted this from. The wonderful opening line of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, one of my favorite books of all times. All happy universities are alike. unhappy universities are unhappy in their own way. So given the challenge, hopefully you've seen the case I've tried to build. We have this obligation to address the great challenges of our time. Our students expect it, our staff expect it, our alumni expect it, our community expect it. We also have to adapt if we're going to flourish and grow as an institution, given the changes in higher education. And I've tried to give you a sense of both the opportunities and the challenges that we face. But how do we do it? What does it mean to be a happy university at this point in time in the 21st century? This is one of my favorite books of the year, so this is a book plug. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. But how do we as an institution think about the kind of change that is required? What is, to be a bit philosophical for a moment, what is our theory of change? How do we deal with change as an institution? And I think this is it seems a very abstract thing, right? But I think it's a fundamentally important question for us to grapple with as we kick off our strategy process, really from today. Some things we shouldn't change. And in the last 5 minutes or so, I just want to sort of be clear about that, because there's nothing more, I think, depressing than being told everything is horrible and we have to change everything. That isn't the argument I'm making. Some things we shouldn't change. We are a truth-seeking institution. That is core to who we are. Pursuing questions wherever they take us. That should remain a fundamental element. It's in our bones as a university. We are a truth-seeking institution, and that is not something we should ever compromise or walk away from. We have a deep commitment to academic freedom and inclusion, and this is for a longer conversation, but for me, these two principles, often presented as intention, are fundamentally complementary, right? The freedom principle allows us to pursue questions wherever they go, but the inclusion principle means we have the right conversations in order to hopefully get to the right answers, because we have a diversity of perspectives contributing to them. So we pursue the truth, and we pursue it in concert, in conversations with other, embracing the epistemic humility that comes with that. And of course, what shouldn't change is a deep commitment to teaching and research excellence. That should motivate everything we want to do. We want to be one of the great public universities of the 21st century. But as I said, how do we adapt? What are we learning from what's happening around the world? And let me just be sort of quick fire suggestions here, just to get the brain flowing. I think higher education is starting to evolve in these ways. It's becoming more unbundled, digital, stackable, online, in person, more distributed. We need to form more partnerships, local, regional, global. It's becoming more focused on durable skills. Content is everywhere. Wisdom is often nowhere. So how do we close that gap? It's becoming more experiential. We need to give more of our students the opportunity to learn by doing. And that's not just in engineering. That includes in philosophy and history and chemistry and biology as well. And it's becoming more flexible, portable, personalized, extended, not 18 to 24, 18 to 74. And of course, interestingly, at the same time, it's becoming more integrated. There are all these really innovative rebundlings of education that are occurring. How do we respond to that agenda? Okay, let me try and start to bring things to a conclusion and then open it up. What do I think great 21st century universities will look like? And in some ways, this is an open question. This is a hypothesis, so I invite you to fill in your own ideas here. I think there are 10 things that will define a great 21st century university. No trade-off between research and teaching excellence. We're engines for growth and inclusion. We're place-based, but global in aspiration. We're focused on closing the gap between discovery and impact, accelerating the point between discovery and impact. We're multidisciplinary in everything we do across teaching and research. We're porous, deep, diverse, long-term relationships. made manifest not only in the physical infrastructure of our campus, but also in the way we operate virtually and relationally. We're technologically adept. I'm waiting for the laughter to begin now. Seamless movement between the physical and the digital. We expect it on the apps on our phone. Why shouldn't we expect it in our classrooms and on our campuses? We're socially responsible, and particularly, and this is something, you might have noticed I'm working really closely with the student union this year on. We're socially responsible, at least also in the sense of building dialogue across difference, modeling how we have difficult conversations, robust conversations, hard conversations that are so lacking in the public culture. There's enough shouting. We need to have more conversations, and we should model that. And we should be philanthropically ambitious. In fact, philanthropy will be the difference, I think, between many of the universities at this point in the 21st century. Philanthropy gives you that margin of excellence. And hopefully will be creative, innovative, and joyful, because life is too short. One question that people have asked me is, how have you experienced sort of Manchesterness? Like, what's Manchester mean to you? I got asked on national radio the other morning what it meant to me. And of course, I'm not going to go through all these. Pick your favorite one, the pulsating sound of Joy Division, Alan Turing, one of my, I think, go-tos is the extraordinary legacy of the Pankhursts. But I think in a nutshell, what makes Manchester distinctive is that combination of collaboration, connectivity, and creativity. There's something, I think, quite magical in the mix that is expressed in the institutions and ways of working in this city. Okay, so to conclude, that's the agenda for the next 8 months. What kind of university? You laugh, we're a university, we can do anything. That's the framework for the agenda for the next 6 months, because it's going to take at least 10 years to get to grips with it. So we're kicking off our Manchester 2035 strategy really from today. And we're going to ask you to focus on 5 areas that all touch on these sort of meta, national, regional, and local challenges that I've outlined. Advancing social responsibility, accelerating our research impact, reimagining student experiences, basically figuring out how we can fund a world-class university into the future, in part for some of the reasons I've given you. And then, of course, a critical, I think, new theme for us, becoming one university. Because if we're going to have any hope of tackling these challenges, of really addressing some of those great questions that the world is asking us, we're going to have to work together as we've never worked together before. Okay, I started with reference to one very famous German philosopher. I'm going to end with reference to another, a philosopher named Jürgen Klopp, who said, it's less important what people say when you come in. It's much more important what people say after you've left. So what will people say about us after 2035? I guess that's the question, the last question I want to leave you with. Thank you. Okay, so we've got some time for questions, and what I thought would be really helpful is to ask a couple of colleagues who've been listening patiently and also thinking about these issues in all kinds of ways themselves to sort of kick things off. So I'm going to turn to a couple of colleagues first and then open it up to the floor. So I'm going to start with Lexi from the Students' Union. Lexi, where are you? There you are, yes.
Just here.
Maybe introduce yourself and then we'll...
Yeah, sure. So I'm Lexi, and I'm the Union Affairs Officer at the Students' Union. And my job title was a bit weird, like what does it mean to represent the affairs of a union? But in simple terms, I sit on lots of committees on the Board of Governors, and I'm the co-chair of the Board of Trustees. So that's my job. Yeah, so I think coming back to the question of what type of university do we need to be by 2035, I mean, it's not a complex question. It's not an easy question to answer in any sense of the word. But I think to me, it means that we focus on equity, opportunity, and access. All students need to be afforded the right to go to university. It needs to be an option for every single student studying across the country. And we also need to be a university that welcomes students from across the country, no matter their background or where they've come from. And I think once they're here, it's amazing that they arrived, but we need to actually help them thrive once they are here. And how that looks will mean something different to every single student. To some, that means focusing on their academic work, and to others, that means focusing on their co-curricular work. For me, I focused a lot on the Mancunian and Fuse FM, so student journalism, whereas for others, that's politics or student societies or running events, anything like that. So I think that the student academic experience goes hand in hand with the co-curricular experience. So we need to make sure that students have the best time possible at the Students' Union and at the University of Manchester. And that's a huge mission. It's not an easy thing to achieve in any way, particularly when we have the cost of living crisis, which has become the new normal. Students are bearing the brunt of it in many different ways. And I went to a conference recently, and they said that it costs universities upwards of £1 million a day to run. I think, Carol, you might dispute me on this figure, but it costs us £2 million a day to run the University of Manchester, whereas students are spending about £80 to £100 a week on their living expenses. So there's a huge disparity there, and I'm not saying that we put £2 million in students' pockets. I mean, that is quite unrealistic. But I'm saying that students are struggling with money, and that is meaning they're not having the same access and opportunity available to them. So I think we need to work on that, on making sure that students can come to University of Manchester and have all these different options available to them and have the best time here. And we look forward to doing that in partnership with the university, like the Students' Union. University are very lucky to have a very close working relationship. But we need to continue that in our third century and make sure that every student has the best possible time here in any sense of the word. So yeah, I think that is my answer to where do we need to be by 2035. We need to think about...
I hope somebody is taking notes.
We need to think about the type of university that we want to be. Do we want to be one that is open to only a limited part of the population, or one that is open to all? And it's a big question, don't get me wrong, but I think that we should be one that is open to all, that is open to affording all opportunities the same level of equity and access and opportunity. And that comes in many different shapes and forms, but it's something which I think is really important, because the university relies on its students, and the students are at the heart of everything that the Students' Union does and the university does. And we need to keep pushing on that and driving on that and making sure that students, who are quite literally the future of the UK and the world, are at the heart of everything we do. So yeah, that is my answer.
Thanks, Lexi. Okay, now next, Lou Cordwell. Many hats, but Lou.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So I recently-ish joined the university. My background is as a tech entrepreneur, and my focus in the university is on the innovation agenda. So doing a lot of work with Duncan and the team, thinking about many of the things that you touched on today. I think what excites me and scares me, I guess, a little bit about the opportunity and the challenge at the moment is Manchester, as you've highlighted, is in a really unique position. We're outperforming the UK on many levels. There is a sense, for those of us that are long enough in the tooth to remember this, there's a bit of a renaissance, I guess, about the brand. Oasis is probably going to help with that a little bit more when we get there. But I think, we are in a really interesting time from a UK economy perspective. The second cities in the UK are going to have to do their job from a growth agenda. Innovation is going to be absolutely critical. And what's really interesting is we're stood here in the single biggest innovation asset that this region has. So I think that question of the role that we play as an institution, as an organisation that's deeply embedded and deeply connected, as you say, to our place, is one that's been keeping a lot of us, I guess, awake at night. I think the other thing that is beginning to really shine through, that probably won't come as a surprise to anybody who's in the room or operates in the city, is there's a very clear version of innovation and that's shining through, that's an opportunity for Manchester, which is around that more inclusive model. So all of the points that you talked to around, we've had extraordinarily successful growth and lots of cranes, but we have a model of growth that doesn't work for all of our citizens. So I think our double challenge, if you like, and our double opportunity is how not only we become, we would like to think, the most innovative university in Europe, which is, I think, what we're going to shoot for, unless Duncan tells me otherwise, but how we do that and take all of our communities and our citizens and people with us. So I think that's Manchester's opportunity. I was going to maybe ask you a question.
Okay,
back,
go for it,
Duncan, go for it. Which is, in that challenge, I mean, I was delighted you quoted Mustafa Suleyman, who I endlessly quote to colleagues all the time. But I think when you read any of that kind of body of work around those frontier technologies like AI and biotechnology, and we've got lots of colleagues here who are topic expert on that, we talk about the 10-year window, but the next 5-year window becomes incredibly important. So I think I'd be really interested to, to hear your thoughts on how the biggest innovation institution responds to that at pace.
No, look, the sequencing, and this is the kind of hard work we need to do over the next few months. The sequencing of, the work we need to do will be important. So I guess the way I see it is, as we start to articulate the scale of our ambition, as we start to articulate then the choice set that we have, do we, for example, really double down on our digital, what I think of as our digital campus, for example. We've got 47,000 students on campus. Maybe we should have 50,000 students online. Maybe not. Maybe we don't want to do that. But as we articulate, as a way of responding, obviously, to some of those challenges and some of those opportunities and some of those sort of numbers I shared with you, as we think about those challenges, we also have to think about what's important over 3 years, over 5 years, over 10 years, over 25 years. And I guess my thinking at this stage is open to debate, open to conversation, is we kind of carve up our strategy into sort of work packages where we're trying to both address the immediate short-term opportunities, new government, a city planning to do new things and different things now, with where we need to be as an institution by 2035 and then 2050 beyond that. So how do we kind of break up the work so we do that in a kind of rational way? So don't really have a definitive answer yet, but that's something that I think we need to grapple with as a community. So thanks, Lou. Maybe one more question. Rory Brooks, wonderful supporter of the university. Rory, wonderful to have you here. Any thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Duncan, for the invitation. One thing about universities is you don't have to run into an awful lot of very smart people all in a room at one time. And this room is definitely an example of that. A little personal journey. I first landed at this university in 1972. And so that's now over 50 years ago, which has passed in a flash. But as we celebrate the bicentenary of the university, I think I've been engaged with it on and off for a quarter of its lifetime. And you may think that makes me argue that I should be looking backwards. But my sustained interest in the university is kept by a relentless desire for its improvement in the future. And shortly after, in fact, the day after Elizabeth and I got married, we moved to the United States for 9 years. And as young people, we discovered this enormous bond between graduates and their college institutions, which gave them lifelong social capital. And I think that the UK has been well behind on that, but it is now definitely getting better. And I think membership of this extraordinary institution, this extraordinary club, is a badge and a privilege that I wear with pride every single day, and I hope that you do too. And those of you who are informing the student body, as you are, actually, I hope that you will make them feel the same way when they leave university. I've sometimes felt that there is something of an either-or view to certain aspects of university life. One is that we're either brilliant at research or we're brilliant at teaching. And I don't think the either-or option is applicable or is necessary. And I think that actually excellence in research and excellence in teaching are highly compatible propositions. And it's very clear, looking at the statistics that you, Duncan, have pointed out, that this university needs to give better student satisfaction led by teaching and the rest of the student experience. The other tension is between civic and global. These, again, are not incompatible propositions. This is an outstandingly rooted civic institution, but it also has global reach for all the research that it does, for the huge diaspora of its student body. We have hundreds of thousands of students around the world. And it is entirely strong that people from the international community get a better idea of the university because it is so civically rooted, that it is profoundly an established and rooted institution and is not going to disappear in front of them. I feel elsewhere that there's some tension between tradition and innovation. I simply think we have to understand that those are not competing propositions, and that only by driving forward, especially as a research and teaching institution, will we enhance the tradition that we already have. As fortune smiled upon my business, I had the opportunity to return some favors to the university, and we've had the pride to fund and support the Global Development Institute. And that kind of funding can do things that are not immediately obvious and available to the university from other sources. How can a Global Development Institute go out and measure the impact of what its research is doing? How can it find out whether new ideas might actually be effective on the ground? And above all, how can it change the dialogue that exists between Global North and Global South to be a single global dialogue of equitable and equal partnership relationships? Those kind of aspirations and goals cannot easily be achieved by conventional funding means. And although philanthropy and other forms of funding are a small part of the total revenue of the university, they are a huge part of the discretionary income that the university has at its disposal. The single funding option model is no longer an option. Universities such as this one must embrace multiple funding models for the future. And the last word, which I think people find a bit touchy, the last two words are aspiration and ambition. Ladies and gentlemen, lose your doubts about aspiration and ambition. Let us be a very ambitious and aspirational institution. Let this please be a much happier university. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Roy. Okay, so we've got time for questions. There's people watching online, and we're using Mentimeter, so there are upvoted questions coming. Why don't I just see if there are any questions in the room now? We'll just move to questions now in the room. We'll take one or two right down here at the front, and then we'll go online. So we'll try and squeeze in as many as we can before we move on.
Thank you so much, Duncan. I'm Professor Sadiq Qureshi in the History Department, and I wanted to ask about teaching. I think even in the last decade of teaching, my experience of teaching has really changed, because I think what the students need and want from us has changed so much. I think there's been a generational shift in how they learn, how they're educated, making the way that we teach really not fit for purpose. And I don't mean just at Manchester, across the sector. And of course, some institutions have addressed that through various kinds of initiatives about diversification or decolonizing, but they haven't really been joined up. So I wonder, especially in terms of addressing NSS, what you envisage, and is there a possibility to join all these conversations to really rethink not only what students need, but what they want and what we can provide for them? Because I think we could be exceptional at that. But I still think we're teaching models that only worked a long time ago.
So, fantastic question. I mean, the short answer is yes, absolutely, we should be tackling that issue, and NSS is just one small piece of it. And I think we need to be careful we need to pay attention and address it and fix it, but at the same time, it's only one piece of the puzzle, and the opportunity is much bigger. I mean, I tend to be someone who likes to look at opportunities rather than deficits necessarily, but NSS is also telling us something, so we need to take it seriously. So I guess, the one thought I'd say is I do think we need to find a way to create opportunities and time for our colleagues to be reflective about their teaching and to be supported in developing the skills if they don't have those skills, or to be supported to help their colleagues think in new ways about their teaching. So one thing I hope we can do in the strategy discussion around our student experience and more broadly around innovation is to think about how we become an innovative university, not only in our research, not only in the way we get our ideas out into the world, but in relation to teaching and learning. And I guess one thing I'm really interested in is the extent to which we can get the balance right between the digital and the physical. Are there ways in which we can personalize a student's experience at an institution with 47,000 students, and yet also offer them all the benefits that an institution of our size can offer them, that you can combine a language with history or politics or chemistry or physics, or combine subjects in ways that other universities can't. So I'm really interested in that sort of digital physical interface. We're not really there yet. There's amazing work being led by colleagues like Dan George and others on that flexible learning program, and that April and the team are thinking about, but I think we have so much further to go. So I guess that's the space where I think we can innovate, and it'd be good to get people thinking about that over the next few months. Okay, maybe one more question in the room, and then I'll go to Jamie and see if there's something online. Any other questions in the room?
Hiya. Given all the challenges that you've laid out that we face as a university, and so I'm one of the other student union officers, and also given what Lexi said about the challenges that particularly working class students face in accessing university nowadays, we've seen the government, reports at least, that the government may be looking to increase tuition fees, one of the biggest barriers that students currently face. Do you believe that a marketized education system can be sustainable, can be accessible, can be a force for social justice as you want it to?
I mean, not a purely marketized system, no. And I think one of the risks we face in the UK now, as I said, if you look at the OECD data, the UK is at the bottom of the table in terms of the contribution that public sources make to the costs of a student's education. Students are bearing the vast proportion of that at a level that is unique in the OECD, if I could put it that way. So a purely marketized system is not going to deliver the things we want, because it does exclude, not only, there's both a social justice argument and there's a kind of straightforward economic argument. We need to expand access to higher education, including further education and universities, because otherwise we won't have the economy we need in the future. I mean, there's a very practical aspect to it. But also, there are too many communities who have not benefited from the growth in enrollment and the growth in higher education that we should be celebrating otherwise. I didn't show it here, but there's a kind of scissor graph, which I find very challenging because it's been put to me in lots of different ways. And it's the rate of growth of enrollments, and it's the rate of economic growth in productivity. And it's a scissor graph. They're heading in the opposite direction. And people will say, okay, explain that. So a purely marketized system isn't the solution. And I guess the way I see the future of higher education is very much as a system, and being able to connect institutions in a more integrated way. So that requires unbundling the way we do things now to a certain extent, and then rebundling. And in principle, I'm a big fan, although it doesn't work perfectly like this. Think of the California system, right? In principle, you can start at a strip mall in Oakland and end up doing art history in Berkeley, or vice versa. And you want a system in which people can move through with the right balance between student and public contribution in order to be able to contribute and participate, not just in the economy, but in society and life. So I don't think a purely market, in some ways, the UK has experimented with that purely marketized approach, and we're kind of dealing with the fallout of that now. And I think we'll need to think differently about it in the future. Okay. Jamie, is any upvoted questions online?
Yes. Well, the two with the most votes actually are on a similar theme. So the first is, how can we make sure that bureaucracy no longer stands in the way of brilliant individuals or groups having the resources they need to deliver your vision of excellence? And I guess the second one is along a similar theme, but it concludes, do we have the guts for the big reforms needed to propel us to excellence?
So, I mean, you could substitute the word like president and vice-chancellor in the way of, rather than bureaucracy. I hope not. I mean, like I said, I think in an earlier lovely reception downstairs, I said my ideal of university leadership is, real clarity about the direction and purpose of the institution and being very rigorous and disciplined about that, but also having a distributed model of leadership where you've got a community of leaders, in a sense. That's really the only way you can deliver significant change and reform. It's never exclusively from the top. But having said that, you need to be clear about where you're wanting to go. So that requires also a distinct form of leadership. So there's no question that one thing people have been telling me is that we are a very, very bureaucratic organization. We love a committee. We love a task and finish group, a phrase I did not know until I came to the University of Manchester. We love, our governance structures are, in some sense, have been designed for a previous era, as important and significant, as useful as they have been for those purposes. But we do need to reduce the governance overhead as best we can. And that's something we've already started, and you'll hear more about that in the coming weeks. And it's something that hopefully, for those of you seeking to, remove the bureaucrats from the castle, then get involved in the strategy process, and let's see what we can do. Okay, we've got time for one more question. We'll take one in the room. I saw a hand right in the middle, right there. I think there was one hand right there. And then we'll have to wrap up.
Thank you for an inspiring lecture. I'm Jeff Livermore, Emeritus Professor of the Built Environment. The built environment doesn't feature particularly well in Manchester at the moment, but there are two issues that are key to it. There's the Grenfell Tower, and also climate change, where 30 to 40% of emissions come from buildings. And throughout both those things, there's ethics and morality. And I think you're ideally situated to bring out the ethics and morality, which is needed across the board when you look at what's happened in those instances and how future society actually depends. How are you going to get morality more into the courses and into the spirit of Manchester University?
So I'm pleased to announce that every student will have to do a course in philosophy at the University of Manchester. No, just kidding. Fiona Devine is falling over in her chair right now as I say that. No, look, it is a really interesting question, and of course, most of my colleagues are thinking about these questions in their daily practice, whether they're in civil engineering, built environment, chemistry, biology, or indeed in philosophy. I actually think one thing I'd love us to really focus on is the way in which we produce graduates who bring that multidisciplinary perspective to the challenges they'll face once they leave us, including doing things for the right reasons and not only for the most expedient reasons. I think if you look at all the examples you gave, whether it's Grenfell, the tainted blood scandal, the post office scandal, Hillsborough, at some point people didn't do the right thing. At some point the system kind of carried them along. So how do we produce graduates that will say stop? And how do we give them the skills and the attributes once they leave us to challenge and question and do so obviously in a constructive, positive, and sometimes in a very uncomfortable making way. I think that's something I'd love us to really grapple with as a university, because I think that's again one of our responsibilities, especially for an institution like ours that is graduating so many students from so many different backgrounds, so many different cultural and geographic backgrounds. How do we equip them to be great leaders of the future? I think that's a great ambition task for us in the future. Thank you so much for your questions and for listening. I'm going to hand it back now to Philippa.
I'm going to thank Duncan in a minute. Before I thank Duncan, I'm actually going to thank Samantha. The phrase "pull focus," does that ever come up? I thought you were amazing. Thank you very much for some amazing work. Thank you. So what I heard were two things. I said earlier to the group who were downstairs earlier that it was very clear that collectively the institution wanted a new Vice-Chancellor who would have the skills and experience to lead, to listen, and to inspire. And I heard all those things. But I also heard, for most of the people in the room, an enormous amount of work. If that's 8 months of exploration and work and coming to answer your questions, Duncan, I think we've had our agenda set. So point noted. In a minute, those of you who are going to the honorary degree ceremony need to move, I hesitate to say it, reasonably briskly, if you wouldn't mind. So if those of you who aren't going to that, if someone's looking like they need to move briskly, could you let them move briskly, if you wouldn't mind? Thank you, Lexi and Lou and Rory, for your thoughtful comments. Thanks for the really good questions on some of the important issues that were raised. And thank you for your responses, Duncan. So I'm going to ask one more time for some recognition of Duncan's inaugural address.